Even though it seems like a tightly integrated set of software components, SQL Server actually consists of a dizzying array of Windows services, standalone tools, network protocols, and other components. You might expect to use several tools to set every option. But the SQL Server Configuration Manager brings many of these options together, letting you manage various aspects of the outward face of SQL Server and its interaction with its exterior environment. We'll go ahead and start SQL Server Configuration Manager from the Start menu here. If I go down here to Microsoft SQL Server 2016, should be in there, SQL Server 2016 Configuration Manager. I'll go ahead and click on that. And there's the tool. So as you can see, there's a tree view on the left that lists three main groups of options, with both 32 and 64-bit options for a couple of the groups. So the first one is SQL Server Services. This lets you configure the services that are used by various components of SQL Server 2016, as well as let you see the current status of each. So you can see that I have SQL Server Integration Services, Full Text Filter, SQL Server Browser, SQL Server Agent. And you can see that it's these three are currently running. A couple of them are currently stopped. Those are the default settings for those new services, as well as the start mode here. The account that it logs in as, these were set at installation, process ID, useful for low-level debugging, but not really other things. And then for a couple of them, the service type information. So this is the service for the core database engine, SQL Server, as well as the name that I defined for this service during installation. I can right-click on this, and as you can see, I have Start, Stop, and Pause. Start is disabled because it's currently running, but I could stop it, I could pause it, and I can also restart it. So if I pause it, then if I come back into this right-click menu, Resume would be enabled. So these are typical settings for Windows services. But the nice thing about the Configuration Manager is that it pulls together all of the services here for SQL Server into a single location. And it's important to keep in mind that the list of services that appears here depends upon the features that I installed. In this particular instance of SQL Server, I didn't install analysis services or reporting services and so forth, and so those don't appear here. Had I installed those, or any other services that make up SQL Server, there's about something like 10 altogether, potentially, then they would appear here as well, and I can manage them the same way as all of the services. And then the other option here is I can go into Properties, and this lets me change the account name, use a built-in account, configure the different services, configure file stream, so you can start to see where I can change some of the configuration settings that I set during installation. Okay, startup parameters, as well as some advanced features there. So one of the things I want to emphasize too is that you'll always want to use Configuration Manager to configure SQL Server services, as well as the service accounts. The big benefit of using this tool is that it takes care of managing permissions for the accounts that you choose. Otherwise, you have to do it manually, which is really tedious and really easy to get wrong. You can open up security vulnerabilities if you don't have a deep understanding of the implications of what you're changing. Okay, the second part of the tool here, let me move that over a little bit, is the SQL Server network configuration. So there's the 32-bit version of it. Notice that because I'm running a 64-bit version of SQL Server on a 64-bit version of Windows, I don't have anything listed there. So instead, I need to come down here for the protocols, which are the 64-bit versions of the protocols. So these are the protocols that SQL Server listens to for client connections. So you'll want to enable protocols that clients will use and disable any that they won't use. That's all part of reducing the attack surface. If you're not going to be using a protocol, then you shouldn't enable it. And also similarly, if you're not going to use it, if you're not going to use shared memory, then you'll want to disable that. Although most of the time you're going to use shared memory. Okay, so for each instance, the display shows whether each protocol is enabled. And I can right-click on each of these and enable them as well as set properties. Now, it's going to be a fairly rare production instance of SQL Server that I'm not going to use TCP/IP to connect to the server. But I could also use named pipes. So in this particular case, I'll go ahead and enable TCP/IP. And notice the caution here. Any changes made is going to be saved as soon as I make it here within the tool. But they're not going to take effect until I stop the service and restart it. And that certainly occurs if I were to reboot the server. Okay, so I'll click on OK. And now that's enabled, although it's strictly speaking, right now I can't make a connection to this instance of SQL Server until I restart the service. And I can do that back up here within SQL Server Services. Now, each of these protocols is fairly advanced in order to understand what each of those is used for. But if I'm only going to use applications on this server that's going to access this instance of SQL Server, I might be able to get away with shared memory. So for example, if I host a web application on the same server as SQL Server, then it can access it using shared memory. And I probably don't need to enable either of the other protocols. But for the most part, for a production server, particularly a heavily used server, you're not going to want to install multiple types of server software. So a web server on the same server as SQL Server is a recipe for poor performance. But it really depends on how heavily the web server is accessed, how intense the web application hits the database server. So your results may vary. You'll want to test. Maybe it works for you. Okay, and then the last part of the configuration manager is the SQL Native Client 11.0 configuration. I do have a 32-bit version, but there's nothing there because this is not a 32-bit version of SQL Server. It'd really be kind of nice if Microsoft didn't install these, but they're there, so be it. Okay, so there's two sections here. The main one that you're probably going to use is the alias section here. An alias lets you use a name other than the server name, as well as store the protocol used to connect to the server, as well as the server name and custom information appropriate to the selected protocol. So if I right-click on this and create a new alias, I can see that I can give it a custom name that identifies this connection in some way. And then I can specify the port number, the protocol, as well as the server name. Now I'm not going to create any here in this case. But the important thing to understand about this is that these are connections that this SQL Server is going to connect to. So these aren't your own applications that are going to connect to this instance of SQL Server to access data. Instead, these defined the client configurations that allow this instance of SQL Server to connect to other instances of SQL Server to access data or other services. And so you can configure all of those features here.